Now, a great question that for some reason the left hasn't quite figured out, or the liberals haven't quite figured out, because some of them don't like to be called leftists because of just how deranged the left actually is. But why is it that us rational people here on the right, centre-right, even the centre-left, people who were impacted by things like mandates and just by gross incompetence by the 2017 to 2023 Labour governments, why is it that we hate Jacinda Ardern so much? And maybe hate is a strong word, but I know many people do definitely feel that way. But why is it that we're so critical of her even all these years later? Well, firstly, we're going to listen to Paul Politic tell us exactly why, and then I'm going to tell him exactly why he's wrong.
The anti-vaxxers hate Jacinda Ardern. Many of them literally believe that she was comparable to Hitler or Stalin. Many of them literally believe that they were subjected to a Holocaust-level event. It is totally unhinged. By all means, criticise Jacinda Ardern. I did. I criticised the hate speech laws. I criticised the ute tax. I even criticised the vaccine mandates. But I am not going to pretend that she was some brutal dictator. That kind of outlandish rhetoric downplays the true evil of historical dictators. And it makes the case against Ardern look like a complete and utter joke. If Jacinda Ardern was a dictatorial leader, the parliament protesters would have been slaughtered and dumped in a mass grave somewhere. I have released videos criticising Ardern and the vaccine mandates. If this was a dictatorship, I would have been disappeared for that. That is how an actual dictatorship works. You don't get to camp out on parliament grounds for weeks with no consequences beyond inconvenient sprinklers and annoying music. Some people have such a massive victim complex. Do you have any idea what life in an actual dictatorship is like? You don't get to go around ranting about how you hate the government. You don't get to have a big protest. You don't get to post harsh criticism of the leader on the internet. Doing these things will see you imprisoned at best, brutalised and slaughtered at worst. So many people don't realise just how lucky they are. For them, a mildly authoritarian liberal leader is akin to Stalin. It is ridiculous and embarrassing.
I think what Paul ignores the most is context. And I think that's what most arguments of this nature lack. Contextualizing the situation. One, contextualizing the environment in which Jacinda Ardern was operating. She was operating within a liberal democracy where freedom is very, very valuable to the average person, where we are used to at least the illusion of freedom, even if the government is playing far too much of a role in our day-to-day lives. The point being, Jacinda Ardern took the trust, misplaced trust though it may be, but took that trust that the average person has in their prime minister, in their government, and slapped us in the face with it. Now, kudos to him for acknowledging that the vaccine mandates were a problem. That's primarily where I stood on this matter. What he fails to recognise is that Jacinda Ardern, whilst perhaps not being a literal dictator to the lengths of a Stalin, of a Mao, however, what she did do was utilise everything in her kitty, in her tool belt, to be as authoritarian as our laws at the time would allow her to be. She ensured, and she started laying the groundwork for her to be dictator-in-chief. Now, people like to use that phrase with Trump, but Jacinda Ardern was a far better example of it. The Jacinda Ardern, unlike Trump, utilised the COVID pandemic as a means to lock down an entire country on a whim, on just the snap of her fingers. We're going to lock you down, you're going to stay there, and we're going to tell you what conditions allow us to let you out. And you can't do anything about it. No matter what you say, no matter what your belief is, if you want to break our rules that we're imposing with no consultation with you, you will face the consequences of that. Let's look at Brian Tamaki. He was literally put in jail and prosecuted because he breached those rules. You may agree or disagree with those rules. Nonetheless, she utilized powers that many people would believe breached the Bill of Rights Act, among other things, and did as she pleased to get the results that she supposedly sought after. The problem was that she had incompetence along with that, or some might say deliberate incompetence, so that she could continue to wield this power. Because not only did she lock us down with the promise that we need to lock you down to get these cases under control, and then also put into place these systems that will prevent us from needing to lock down again, only for those systems to be, somehow beaten by the most simplest of errors, time and time again. It got to the point where Auckland was in lockdown after lockdown after lockdown, and rather than taking responsibility, Jacinda Ardern blamed the chick that worked at KFC. She blamed everyone but herself. It's not our fault that our own incompetence, our own refusal to adopt proactive changes to the systems that we've attempted to implement didn't work. Right? It's not our fault that our refusal to do better resulted in the same outcome: failure. These mandates, and you yourself, Paul, acknowledge that you didn't agree with them. These mandates were a prime example of where she went wrong. Now, sure, currently in New Zealand, and even back then in New Zealand, you could technically criticise the government, criticise Jacinda Ardern as much as you liked, but to pretend that there were no consequences, or at the very least no consequences that probably shouldn't be occurring in a Western liberal democracy like our own, well, that's just disingenuous. We all know there was consequences. We all know there was pressure on people to not speak up. We all know that she wanted her own citizens to narc on their own family members so that they were complying with the rules. We all know that people who were critical of her and her government, to varying degrees, did get visits by the police. We do know that under her leadership, people were increasingly visited by police simply for having the wrong opinions. I myself was one of them. Be that opinions about her or otherwise, people began to realise that we were increasingly in a state which was lacking liberty, that was lacking the freedom to say what we want without having the government say, "Oh no, we can't have that." I even understand the idea of hate speech laws. The idea that if you are inciting violence and all those sorts of things, that you should be held accountable. But the thing about that is, that's already a thing. You're not allowed to incite literal violence. However, as I think you would have pointed out with the hate speech laws, which is why you yourself took issue with them, the hate speech laws made that rather subjective, didn't it? Oh, it's inciting violence to say that trans men are women. So, things like that. Point being, Jacinda Ardern began laying the groundwork for what was becoming an increasingly authoritarian country. And that is where we took issue. That is why people pushed back as hard as they did. And it wasn't just sprinklers and loud music at the protests. There were people that had their eyes gouged. There were people who were severely hurt by our police, where the police, as far as I was concerned, were in many respects inciting the pushback, inciting the violence against them. Now, the last day was a bit of an exception, but even then, many people will acknowledge it was only a small group of people who were truly to blame for what unfolded on that final day. But I've met several people who were in attendance there, several people, or at least chatted to several people who were there throughout the whole time that the protest was on the ground. And having seen much of the footage, having talked to them, having just taken time to reflect on everything that happened, you cannot say that just because they were allowed to be there for 20-odd days, that disputes the idea that Jacinda Ardern was arguably the most authoritarian prime minister in our country, and that the pain that she inflicted within a Western context was comparable to that of Stalin. And when we say that, we mean it's the rationale behind her behavior. It's she actually believes that she was entitled to treat us that way. It's that she believes that she was justified in her actions, that she is not to blame, that she did everything out of kindness or out of the greater good. It was necessary oppression, and a means to an end. Now, I'm sure if you wanted to just strip away all of the true atrocity of Stalin and Mao and all of that, and you just looked at their rationale, just the very base belief systems, you would find far too much in common. Why is it that Stalin went and killed so many people? What was the rationale for it? Was it the greater good, or was he just bloodthirsty and just enjoyed it? Maybe it was a bit of both. Some people can just be sick. But what was it? What was it more likely that he thought in order to achieve what his nation needed, he needed to take a very hardline, firm, and quite frankly, evil approach? Sure, we can acknowledge Jacinda Ardern didn't kill millions and millions of people. We could acknowledge that. But what she did do was she utilized her power and then some to not only breach our rights, but to inflict both the economic, social, and physical harm on us that no prime minister has ever done in our country before. And so the fact that we would view her the way we do, it should be of no surprise to anyone. She herself acknowledged that she created a two-tier society, despite saying that she never intended to do that. She promised us that, oh no, we're not going to divide people. We're not going to prevent people from doing this. And that's exactly what she did. She lied through her teeth. I look back at her, and every single time she stood up on that stage was her loving it. She loved every moment of it. She got to be there and say, we are your single source of truth. She got to be the hero, with no regard for what she was actually doing, what pain she was inflicting. There are people with lifelong consequences because of her decision. Lifelong illnesses because she refused to do the necessary due diligence before imposing mandates on us, before locking us down, making the decisions that she ultimately did. But what made it worse was the arrogance of her. The gaslighting, the refusal to take accountability, the refusal to see that her claims of kindness are baseless. Her claims of being a strong leader are baseless. The vestigial media the world over's claims that she was a strong leader, superhero, superstar, whatever, were baseless. It was all spin. It was all predicated on lies, on PR. But the results speak for themselves. All she did was inflict pain. She left the country in a far worse place than when she took over. What did we actually get from Jacinda Ardern? We got an economy that was going nowhere. We got more debt than we've ever had before. We had increased numbers of people dying from suicides and a range of other health complications from various different things. And ultimately, we had a future which very few people saw any hope in. Because she doesn't care about this country, she never did. But she also doesn't want to acknowledge that that's what she did. Instead, she wants to pretend like she was some great leader who was misunderstood and had to resign for various reasons which she may or may not be being honest about. That is why people loathe Jacinda Ardern, because she's a deceitful, self-serving individual who did nothing for this country. Absolutely nothing. And now, we have to pick up the pieces. Lovely.